Welcome back for part 4 in our series on industrialization in the United States. In our previous lessons, we have learned about the factors that influenced industrialization, inventions that helped to spur on business, and specialized industries that sprang up in different parts of the country. Today, we are going to look at the people at the top of their industries, as well as the impact of industrialization on the average worker. In order to understand all of this, we need to be able to explain how captains of industry and robber barons impacted society. As you are listening, take notes that help you to answer this question. First, let's define the two terms. A captain of industry is a compassionate man who has used his wealth and influence in a positive way, made important contributions to the nation, and improved the lives of the American people. Some notable examples include Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Alexander Graham Bell, who we've looked at in previous lessons. Each of these men improved the quality of life and/or business models across the country. A robber baron, on the other hand, was a man who became rich through ruthless, dishonest business practices. These men were widely criticized at the time for their fights with the unions over regulations. An example is Boss Tweed. This man was a leader in the Democratic political machine and was responsible for corrupt business deals, including the building of the New York courthouse. Construction costs were around $3 million, but taxpayers ultimately paid upwards of $13 million, which lined his and others' pockets at their expense. So let's take a look at the heads of the 4 biggest industries of the time period to determine whether they were captains of industry or robber barons. These names may look familiar. That's because they are on buildings to this day due to their influence in a crucial period in our history. John D. Rockefeller struck it rich in the oil industry. He founded the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with his brothers after getting into business several years prior. Within 20 years, the Rockefellers controlled nearly 90% of the country's refineries and pipelines. While Rockefeller was criticized for unethical business practices like predatory pricing, he also gave away large portions of his fortune during his lifetime. Next, Andrew Carnegie was a steel magnate. He was Scottish-born and worked his way up through the railroad industry. While there, he invested in iron and oil, and then finally entered the steel business where he made his fortune. After selling his company for $480 million, he dedicated the rest of his life to philanthropy. In all, Carnegie gave away $350 million of his fortune. Third, we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who spent his career fighting for control of the railroad industry. He is infamous for fighting for a controlling stake in the Erie Railroad Company when he already controlled 2 others. Unlike the previous 2 men, Vanderbilt's only notable donation from his vast wealth was a $1 million endowment to open Vanderbilt University in his own name. And lastly, J.P. Morgan was one of the most powerful bankers of his time as he helped leaders of the railroad, steel, and electric corporations organize. His critics claimed that he manipulated the United States financial system for his own gain, and he spent most of his fortune on an art collection. Unfortunately, the average worker is always the one to pay the price for the corrupt business practices of the leaders. In the age of industrialization, there weren't laws protecting workers because the country was on a new frontier and they didn't have any experience to lean on. As a result, there were many struggles to be dealt with. First, children often worked to help their families survive, and there weren't any laws to prevent this. All workers faced low wages and long hours because there were many immigrants in this time period, and there was always someone who would do their job for lower pay out of necessity. These people worked in what were known as sweatshops. In addition to this, they often worked in very unsafe conditions, which sometimes turned deadly. One notable example is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Workers were often locked into their workspace so they couldn't take unauthorized breaks. As a result, when the building caught fire, the workers couldn't escape. 123 women and girls were killed and 23 men. Beyond the bad conditions for workers, things didn't always work out for the consumer either. There weren't any laws preventing monopolies, where a few individuals control an entire industry. This meant that they could essentially charge whatever they wanted for necessities, because there wasn't a competitor with lower prices. Lastly, industrialization had an obvious effect on the environment. Chemicals were going into the waterways and gases into the atmosphere without any oversight. To help counteract many of these problems, workers began to form unions with the goal of improving conditions for everyone. The American Federation of Labor focused on higher wages, better working conditions, and a shorter work week for its members. The Knights of Labor focused on an 8-hour workday and the termination of child labor. Unfortunately, there was no escaping the racism of the time period, and many unions barred African Americans from joining as members. In response to this, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids was the first union to protect the rights of African Americans in the railroad industry. Over the years, unions went on strikes to try to force their employers to meet their demands. Some were successful, others not. In 1892, 3,800 members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers went on strike over wage cuts and working conditions. Henry Frick, one of the bosses, imported 300 Pinkerton detectives, which led to the deaths of 7 detectives and 9 strikers. Ultimately, the violence against the detectives swayed public opinion against the strikers, and the plant was able to reopen with strikebreakers, people who worked in place of the workers on strike. Now that we've reached the end, take a moment to reflect on the essential question. How did captains of industry and robber barons impact society? Which of the men we looked at do you think was a captain of industry? Which do you think was a robber baron? Did they have a positive or negative effect on society, or a little of both? How did society work to improve working conditions for all?